The 9,882nd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Israel to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in the meeting, in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Khaled Khayari, Assistant Secretary General for the Middle East, Asia and Pacific, Departments of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs and Peace Operations, and Mr. Eli Sharabi. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Mr. Khaled Khayari.
Madam President, members of the Security Council, thank you for the opportunity to brief the Council regarding the humanitarian situation faced by the remaining hostages in Gaza. I would like at the outset to recognize Mr. Eli Sharabi and his unimaginable experience of pain and his remarkable resilience in the face of such immense loss. I extend to him my condolences for the tragic loss of his dear family, wife, 2 daughters, and a brother. I pay him, all hostages, living and deceased, and their families and loved ones, my deepest respect and support. I again extend my deepest condolences to all the bereaved families who lost their family members and loved ones during and after the horrific attack by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups in Israel on 7 October 2023. The United Nations continue to unequivocally condemn the appalling acts of terror that took place on 7 October and continued holding of hostages in Gaza. Nothing can justify the intentional killing, torture, sexual violence, and destruction. Entire families murdered, burned in their homes, taken hostage. The events of that horrific day will not be forgotten. The participation in Security Council meeting of surviving hostages and their heart-wrenching testimonies and many months of agony serve as a stark reminder, but also as a crucial symbol of endurance and hope for those still waiting to see their loved ones back home. Since the attacks, the Secretary General and other senior UN officials have regularly met with the families of hostages and have been deeply moved by their stories and by the torment and anguish they have endured. Madam President, the ceasefire and hostages release deal that took effect on 19 January offered a glimmer of hope and respite by reuniting 25 Israeli hostages with their loved ones and returning the remains of 8 deceased hostages who were killed on 7 October or while in captivity to their families. Their release and return were sadly also a moment of great anxiety, as most of the living hostages were paraded in front of crowds, and the coffins of the deceased, including those of 2 young children who were killed in captivity, were displayed publicly by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups during appalling ceremonies that violated international law. The United Nations has repeatedly condemned the parading of coffins containing the bodies of dead Israeli hostages and public displays accompanying the release of living and deceased hostages, including statements made under duress. As of today, at least 59 hostages, alive and deceased, including Eli's brother body, Yossi Sharabi, are still being held captive by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups. The testimonies of those released provide terrifying accounts of their captivity, including physical and psychological torture, sexual violence, and deprivation, indicating that those left behind continue to suffer in horrific conditions, exposed to trauma and suffering since their abduction. The hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. Until their release, they must be allowed to receive visits and support from the International Committee of the Red Cross, and they must be treated with dignity and respect in line with humanitarian principles. Madam President, the resumption of hostilities on 18th of March adds further despair and uncertainty for those remaining hostages, their families, and their loved ones. This resumption of hostilities amidst significant Israeli airstrikes in Gaza has also been devastating for the civilian population in the Strip. Hundreds of Palestinians have been killed, including women and children. Since the resumption of hostilities, one United Nations Office for Project Services, UNOPS, staff member has also been killed and several have been injured. Commissioner General of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency Lazzarini also informed that in the past few days, another 5 UNRWA staff have been confirmed killed. I reiterate that civilians must be protected, including personnel. The rights and dignity of all those affected by the conflict, whether in Israel, the occupied Palestinian territory, or elsewhere, must be respected and protected. We call on all parties to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law and international human rights law. The return to hostilities threatens all civilians in Gaza. I echo the Secretary General's call for the resumption of serious negotiations, for the ceasefire to be respected, for unimpeded humanitarian assistance to be re-established, and for the remaining hostages to be released immediately and unconditionally. With every passing day, we move further away from the objective of returning the remaining hostages safely to their homes. This was also very clear from the rescued hostages, Ms. Noah Argamini's remarks to the Council last month, where she told us that every moment under captivity was lived in danger. The resumed hostilities in Gaza, compounded with the lack of access and rapidly deteriorating humanitarian situation, are exposing the remaining hostages to constant danger and life-threatening conditions. As Under-Secretary General Fletcher briefed you earlier this week, a renewed ceasefire is the best way of protecting civilians in Gaza, in the occupied Palestinian territory, and in Israel, releasing hostages and detainees and allowing aid and commercial supplies in. We remain steadfast in our commitment to protecting human rights, defending humanitarian principles, and supporting all efforts that promote peace, stability, and a more hopeful future for all people in the Middle East. We are also convinced that the only path to durable peace will be achieved when Israel and Palestine live side by side in peace and security, in line with international law and relevant UN resolutions, with Jerusalem as the capital of both states. The United Nations stands ready to do all it can to support the parties in reaching that objective, and it will continue to do all it can to support an end to this suffering. Once again, I reiterate the Secretary General's deep concern for this conflict's unbearable impact on the victims and his urgent call for the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages. Thank you, Madam President.
And I thank Mr. Ghayari for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Eli Sharabi.
My name is Eli Sharabi. I am 53 years old. I've come back from hell. I've returned to tell my story. I used to live in Kibbutz Be'eri with my British-born wife, Liane, and my daughters, Noya and Yahel. It was a beautiful community. We were all passionate about creating the best life for our children and for our neighbors. At 16, I left Tel Aviv for Be'eri, seeking a peaceful home, away from the concrete city. I found a loving community and knew I would raise my family there. Many asked why we lived near Gaza, but to me, Be'eri was heaven. Liane came from Bristol, UK, as a volunteer. She was meant to stay a few months, but she met me and we fell in love. We were married for 23 years and had 2 wonderful daughters and a dog, Mocha. On October 7, my heaven turned to hell. Sirens began, Hamas terrorists invaded, and I was ripped away from my family, never to see them again. For 491 days, I was kept mostly underground in Hamas terror tunnels, chained, starved, beaten, and humiliated. I was held captive in the darkness, isolated from the world by Hamas terrorists. They took pleasure in our suffering. I survived on scraps of food with no medical attention and no mercy. When I was released, I weighed just 44 kilos. I had lost over 30 kilos, nearly half my body weight. For 491 days, I held on to hope. I imagined the life we would rebuild. I dreamed of seeing my family again. Only when I returned home, I learned the truth. My wife and my daughters had been slaughtered by Hamas terrorists on October 7. I'm here today, less than 6 weeks ago after my release, to speak for those still trapped in that nightmare. For my brother Yossi, murdered in Hamas captivity, his body still held hostage. For Alon Oel, still 50 meters underground, I swore to him that I would tell his story. For Hirsch, Ori, Eden, Carmel, Almog and Alexander, murdered in cold blood by their captors. For every hostage still in Hamas' hands, I'm here to tell you the whole truth. On the morning of October 7, at 6:29 a.m., the red alerts began to come through on Liane's phone. I told her not to worry. It will be over soon, I said. Minutes later, we heard that terrorists were infiltrating our community. They were inside the kibbutz. Again, I reassured her, the army will come. They always come. We heard gunfire, screaming, explosions, and then we heard the terrorists at our door. We had no weapons, no way to fight back. Liane and I made a decision we would not resist. We hoped we could save our daughter. The door opened, our dog barked, the terrorist opened fire. Liane and I threw ourselves over our daughters, screaming for the terrorists to stop. Suddenly, 10 terrorists were inside my home. They took our phones. 2 of them grabbed me. They took my wife and daughters to the kitchen. I couldn't see them anymore. I didn't know what was happening to them. I was screaming their names, and they were screaming mine. I told Liane not to be afraid, but this was fear beyond anything I've ever felt. Then I knew I was being taken. As they dragged me out, I called out to my girls, I will be back. I had to believe that. But that was the last time I ever saw them. I didn't know I should have said goodbye forever. Outside was like a war zone. My peaceful home, my slice of heaven, was gone. I saw over 100 terrorists filming themselves, celebrating, laughing, partying in our gardens as they massacred my friends and neighbors. They dragged me out, they dragged me to the border, beating me the whole way. My face was swollen, my ribs bruised. When we arrived in Gaza, a mob of civilians trying to lynch me. They pulled me from the car, but the terrorists rushed me away into a mosque. I was their trophy. I thought about Lian, Noya, and Yahel. Were they still alive? For the first 52 days, I was held in an apartment. I was tied up with ropes. My arms and legs were tied so tightly, the ropes tore into my flesh. I was given almost no food, no water, and I couldn't sleep. The pain was unbearable. Sometimes I would just faint from the pain, only to wake up to that pain again and again. Then, on November 27, 2023, Hamas took me into a tunnel, 50 meters underground. Again, the chains were so tight, they ripped my skin. They never took them off, not for a single moment. Those chains tore at me until the day I was released. Every step I took was no more than 10 centimeters. Every walk to the bathroom took an eternity. I cannot begin to describe the agony. It was hell. I was fed a piece of pita a day, maybe a sip of tea. Hunger consumed everything. They beat me. They broke my ribs. I didn't care. I just wanted a piece of bread. There was never enough food. Sometimes, if we begged enough, we would get something extra. We had to choose an extra piece of pita or a cup of tea. Sometimes they threw us dry dates, and it felt like the greatest gift in the world. We had to beg for food, beg to use the bathroom. Begging was our existence. We strategized over every meal. One day, I cut myself with a razor, just to make them believe I was injured. I collapsed on my way to the bathroom so they would think I was too weak and encourage them to give us more food. It worked. They gave us more food. We survived of those small victories. Do you know what it means to open a refrigerator? It is everything. To be able to reach and take a piece of fruit, an egg, a piece of bread. I dreamt of this simple act every day. For months, we lived like this. I stopped counting the days. Living as a hostage, you don't know how the day will begin, nor how it will end, whether you live or die. At any moment, they could beat you. At any moment, they could kill you. You wake up every day and do not know when you will be able to eat. It could be 12 p.m., 5 p.m., 11 p.m. This would be the only meal we would have. You hope and pray that there will be no surprises with the captors. You think about how desperately you want to shower. We only got one bath a month with half a bucket of cold water. Toothpaste, toilet paper, forget it. Psychological terror was constant. Every day they told us, the world has abandoned you. No one is coming. By the time I met Alon Noel, who is now 24 years old, we had already endured terrible captivity. We relied on each other for survival. Alon is a very talented pianist, and I remember how he would pretend to play the piano on his body to keep himself sane. He doesn't look like anymore like that. One day, a terrorist took his anger out on me. He stormed in and beat me so badly that he broke my ribs. I couldn't properly breathe for a month. Alon tried to protect me with his own body. You couldn't believe how lucky I felt when Alon told me he had saved one painkiller pill. He gave it to me to get through the night. Alon still has shrapnel in his right eye from the day he was kidnapped. He never received medical care. He never saw the Red Cross. To this day, he is blind in that eye. When I was released, he grabbed onto me, terrified to be left behind. He told me he was happy for me. I promised him it was just a matter of days before we would be home too. I was wrong. Just before my release, Hamas took pleasure in showing me a picture of my brother Yossi. This is my oldest brother, husband for Nira, a father for Yuval, Ophir, and Oren. They told me he was dead. It was like they had brought a massive hammer down on me. I refused to believe it. My brother Yossi was all heart. Those with him in captivity told me that he gave his food to others. On February 8, 2025, I was released. I weighed 44 kilograms. This is less than the body weight of my youngest daughter, Yahel. May her memory be blessed. I was a shell of my former self. I still am. I couldn't believe how I looked. I stood at that sick Hamas ceremony, surrounded by terrorists and a crowd of so-called uninvolved civilians, hoping my wife and daughters were waiting for me. At the handover, I met a representative from the Red Cross. She told me, "Don't worry, you are safe now." Safe? How could I feel safe surrounded by terrorist monsters? Where had the Red Cross been for the past 491 days? Then I arrived home. They told me my mother and sister were waiting for me. I said, "Get me my wife and daughters." And that was when I knew. They were gone. They had been murdered. I'm here today because I survived and I prevailed. But that is not enough. Not when Alon Noel is still there. Not when 59 hostages are still there. Right now, Alon is trapped underground, alone, surrounded by terrorists who torment him. He doesn't know if he will ever see his mother, father, his entire beloved family again. I will not leave him behind. I will not leave anyone behind. Their time has almost run out. I'm here before you now to give my testimony and to ask, where was the United Nations? Where was the Red Cross? Where was the world? I know that you discussed the humanitarian situation in Gaza very often. But let me tell you, as an eyewitness, I saw what happened to that aid. Hamas stole it. I saw Hamas terrorists carrying boxes with the UN and UNRWA emblems on them into the tunnel. Dozens and dozens of boxes, paid by your government, feeding terrorists who tortured me and murdered my family. They would eat many meals a day from the UN aid in front of us, and we never received any of it. When you speak of humanitarian aid, remember this. Hamas eats like kings, while hostages starve. Hamas steals from civilians. Hamas blocks aid from reaching those who truly need it. 491 days. That is how long I starved. How long I was chained. How long I begged for humanity. And in all that time, no one came. And no one in Gaza helped me. No one. The civilians in Gaza saw us suffering. They cheered our kidnappers. They were definitely involved. I was freed less than 6 weeks ago. I met President Trump at the White House and thanked him for securing my release and many others. I appreciate his efforts to free those still held hostage by Hamas. I told him, bring them all home. I met with Prime Minister Starmer at 10 Downing Street. I told him, bring them all home. Now, I'm here before you at the United Nations to say, bring them all home. No more excuses. No more delays. If you stand for humanity, prove it. Bring them home. My name is Eli Sharabi. I am not a diplomat. I am a survivor. Bring them all home. Now. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Sharabi for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. And I want to thank also Assistant Secretary General Chiari for his briefing. The United States commends Eli Sharabi for his courage and for joining us today to provide searing firsthand testimony to the depravity of Hamas. Thank you, Eli. Eli, I offer you our sincere condolences on the unspeakable loss you have suffered of your wife, Lian, and daughters, Noya and Yahel, as well as your brother, Yossi. May their memories be a blessing. The United States condemns Hamas in the strongest terms for these heinous murders. Your presence here in the face of the tragedy you have experienced is moving. Your brave testimony here is one of too many stories. On October 7th, 2023, Hamas brutally massacred almost 1,200 people and took over 250 hostages. The terrorist organization indiscriminately murdered infants and grandparents, partygoers, and Holocaust survivors. President Trump has been clear. Hamas must release all hostages immediately, or there will be hell to pay. 5 Americans still need to come home. Idan Alexander can still return to his parents' arms, but Hamas continues to hold the bodies of Itay Chen, Gadi Haggai, Judy Weinstein Haggai, and Omer Nutra, all brutally murdered in Hamas captivity. Another 54 are held in Hamas tunnels and must be released immediately. Hamas bears sole responsibility for the war and the resumption of hostilities. Fighting could end tomorrow if Hamas released hostages and laid down its arms. As Secretary Marco Rubio put it, this is an outrage. The pillars of America's approach remain resolute. Stand with Israel, stand for peace. Madam President, Hamas has refused all attempts to extend the ceasefire in recent weeks, including a bridge proposal that would have provided calm beyond Ramadan and Passover and allowed time to negotiate a framework for a permanent ceasefire. Madam President and colleagues, it has now been 530 days since Hamas started this horrific conflict, one that has upended so many lives and caused such immense suffering. We must recognize Hamas's savagery for what it is, the acts of a terrorist organization that purposefully committed the worst massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. It was Hamas that engaged in sexual violence toward hostages, released multiple hostages in a condition reminiscent of Holocaust survivors, and murdered and paraded the coffins of the Bibas children through the streets. And it is Hamas who is responsible for the resumption of hostilities, refusing time and time again to accept proposals to extend the ceasefire. We recognize Egypt and Qatar's interest in mediating negotiations, and we look forward to continued discussions with Arab partners on the future of Gaza without Hamas. Hamas is an impediment to peace and has no right to speak on behalf of Palestinians. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. I will now give the floor now to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And thank you, ASG Chiari, for your briefing. The United Kingdom joined the US and France in calling for this important briefing. I would like to add my sincere gratitude to you, Ellie, for the courage you've shown today and every day since those horrific events of 7 October. The suffering you and your family have endured is beyond the imagination. Hamas must be held accountable for their despicable actions, including the murder of your wife, Leanne, a British national, and your 2 daughters. Your powerful testimony also serves as a reminder of the anguish that the remaining hostages held by Hamas continue to endure. This Council has called for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages in all 4 of our resolutions since October 7. I repeat that call today. This includes the release of hostage of Nathan Orr and the return of deceased hostages Shay Levinson and Ellie's brother, Yossi Sharabi, who also have strong links to the UK. We also remain deeply concerned by the appalling treatment of hostages during their captivity, as we have heard from Ellie today, and the shocking images we have seen around their release. In its dedicated reports, the UN has concluded that there were reasonable grounds to suspect sexual violence occurred during the 7th October attacks. President, the UK is also deeply concerned at reports of sexual and gender-based violence against Palestinian detainees by Israeli forces. These allegations must be fully investigated. We reiterate our call for the International Committee of the Red Cross to be granted unfettered and immediate access to the hostages in Gaza and Palestinian detainees. Granting ICRC access is a clear obligation under international humanitarian law. The suffering in Gaza has gone on for far too long. Just yesterday, we heard the tragic news that a UN compound in Deir al-Balah was hit, killing and injuring humanitarian workers, including a British national. Our thoughts are with the victims and their families. And as my Foreign Secretary has said, this appalling incident must be investigated transparently and those responsible held to account. The protection of the UN and humanitarian workers is non-negotiable. And Israel must facilitate a rapid and unhindered resurgence in the flow of aid. We condemn the unacceptable statements from Defense Minister Katz warning of the total destruction of Gaza. President, both Israel and Hamas agreed to a ceasefire deal in January, which provided for the release of all hostages through the 3 phases of the deal. With the Israeli airstrikes this week, which have killed so many Palestinian civilians, that deal has fallen apart. And with it, the best chance we had seen to return the hostages to their families and end the suffering. We call on the parties to urgently return to this deal, for the sake of the hostages and their families who continue to wait in agony for news of their loved ones, and for the sake of the Palestinians in Gaza, who have already suffered terribly. Diplomacy must be the way forward, not bloodshed. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President.
Je remercie tout d'abord Monsieur le Sous-secrétaire général pour son exposé. Et je remercie Monsieur Eli Sharabi pour son témoignage poignant. À Genève, dans mes précédentes fonctions, j'ai eu le triste privilège de rencontrer souvent familles et proches des otages pour exprimer la solidarité de la France et sa détermination à aider à la libération de toutes et tous. Recevez, Monsieur Sharabi, l'expression de ma solidarité et de mon respect au nom de mon pays. Recevez nos condoléances les plus profondes pour la perte que vous avez subie, la perte de celle que vous aimiez. Sachez que nous sommes d'autant plus solidaires que des Français aussi ont été détenus. L'un est revenu, l'autre ne reviendra jamais. Madame la Présidente, jamais nous n'oublierons le traumatisme subi par les otages, leurs familles et le peuple israélien lors des attaques terroristes commises par le Hamas et d'autres groupes terroristes le 7 octobre 2023, attaque qui constitue le pire massacre antisémite depuis la Shoah. Ce Conseil doit aussi les condamner d'une seule voix. Et la France continuera d'agir sans relâche pour la libération de tous les otages. Elle dénonce le calvaire qu'ils ont vécu, qu'ils vivent. Ces otages sont des civils innocents. Ils sont utilisés par le Hamas avec un cynisme et une cruauté confondante. Ils ont été et sont détenus en captivité dans des conditions inhumaines, soumis à des actes de torture qui constituent autant de crimes sans nom. Jamais le Hamas n'a accepté de respecter les lois du droit humanitaire, que ce soit le respect de la dignité des personnes ou simplement l'accès du CICR aux otages comme ils en ont le devoir. Tous les otages doivent être libérés, c'est une priorité absolue. Ils doivent l'être dans la dignité et sans condition. Le Hamas doit mettre un terme aux traitements dégradants et humiliants infligés aux otages. La scénarisation de ces libérations, qui s'ajoute au traumatisme déjà subi, renvoie à des heures sombres de l'histoire. La France réitère sa solidarité sans faille avec les otages, leurs familles et leurs proches. Madame la Présidente, nous reconnaissons le
loved
droit
ones.
d'Israël
Madam
à
President, we
protéger ses
recognize
habitants,
Israel's right to
le
protect
devoir
its residents,
d'Israël
the duty of
d'assurer la
Israel
protection
to
de son pays et
guarantee
de
the
son peuple.
protection of its country and its
Nous
people.
reconnaissons le droit
We
d'Israël à se
recognize
défendre.
Israel's right to
Nous
defend
condamnons une
itself.
nouvelle
We
fois les
condemn
récentes
once
attaques à la
again
roquette
the
du Hamas
recent
contre
rocket fire of
Israël
Hamas
et
against
nous
Israel,
condamnons sans aucune
and
forme de
we
restriction
condemn
le recours du Hamas
unequivocally
à la torture, à la
Hamas's
violence
use of
aveugle.
torture and violence.
Est-ce en
Blind
infligeant de
violence
nouvelles
indeed.
souffrances à la
However,
population
will inflicting new
palestinienne
suffering on the
qu'Israël sera
Palestinian
plus sûr?
people make Israel safer?
La reprise des
The
bombardements
resumption of
israéliens
Israel's bombing
au nom de la libération des otages
to
n'est pas la
ensure the release
solution.
of hostages
Au
is not
contraire,
the
et
solution.
la
On
France
the
la condamne.
contrary, and France condemns
Le
those
blocus
actions.
humanitaire à
The
nouveau imposé par les
humanitarian
autorités
blockade once
israéliennes
again
à Gaza
imposed
doit
by the
cesser.
Israeli authorities in Gaza
Par ailleurs, la
must
France
cease.
condamne
Moreover,
l'attaque
France
contre un
condemns
bâtiment des
the
Nations Unies dans la
attack
bande
on
de
a
Gaza le
United
19
Nations
mars,
building
qui a causé
in
la
the
mort
Gaza
d'un
Strip on the
employé
19th of
d'Unirops
March, which
et grièvement
killed a
blessé
UNEP's
plusieurs
employee
autres.
and
Elle
gravely
adresse ses
wounded several
condoléances aux proches
others.
de
We
la
convey our
victime et aux Nations
condolences to the
Unies.
loved ones of the victim
Elle
and
souhaite un
to
prompt
the United
rétablissement
Nations, and we
aux
wish a
blessés.
speedy recovery to those
Toute
wounded.
la lumière doit être
Full
faite sur les
clarity must be
responsabilités de
garnered
ces incidents
regarding
très graves.
who is
La
responsible for that
protection du
very
personnel
serious
humanitaire
incident.
doit être
The protection of
garantie.
humanitarian personnel must be guaranteed.
Au-delà, nous appelons les parties
Elsewhere, we
à
call upon
reprendre
the
le chemin
parties to
ouvert par l'accord de janvier.
return to the path
Libération
opened
sans
by the
condition de
January
tous les
agreement, the
otages dans la
unconditional release
dignité.
of all hostages in
Reprise
dignity,
immédiate de
the
l'aide
immediate
humanitaire.
resumption of the
Cessez le
flow of
feu.
humanitarian aid,
Lancement
a
des
ceasefire,
négociations de paix.
the launching of
Nous
peace
apportons tout notre
negotiations.
soutien
We
aux
extend our
efforts
full
des
support
États-Unis,
to
de l'Égypte,
the
du
US
Qatar,
efforts, the efforts of
pour que
Egypt
soit
and
retrouvé
Qatar,
le
to
chemin du
ensure
cessez-le-feu.
that all return
Et
to
seul
the
un règlement
path by
politique
the
global du conflit
ceasefire. Only
israélo-palestinien
a
permettra aux
comprehensive
Israéliens et aux
political
Palestiniens
solution
de
to the
vivre côte à côte,
Israeli-Palestinian
en
conflict
paix et
will
en
allow both
sécurité.
peoples to live
C'est dans
side by
cet
side
esprit
in
que la
peace and
France prépare
security.
avec
It's in
l'Arabie
that spirit
saoudite
that with
une conférence
Saudi Arabia
internationale
we are
en
preparing
juin pour
for
la
an
mise en œuvre de
international
la
conference
solution
in
des deux
June for the
États. Elle
implementation
aura
of the
lieu ici à
two-state
New York.
solution. It will be held here in New
Je vous
York.
remercie.
I thank you.
The representative of France for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Madam President, thanks for giving me the floor. I begin by expressing our sincere appreciation to ASG Khiari for his briefings on this latest development. I also listened to Mr. Ali Sharabi's statement and wish to express my sincere condolence to him for the loss of his loved ones. And before proceeding further, I also want to express our deepest condolence for the tragic loss of UNOPS worker and extend our sympathies to those injured in the recent attacks. These attacks are unacceptable and must be thoroughly investigated, and we demand those responsible to be held accountable. We welcome the exchange of hostages and prisoners, allowing them to return to their families and regain their freedom. To demonstrate what can be achieved through dialogue and importance of continuing such engagement and mediation initiatives, we urge all parties to conduct the hostage and prisoner exchange process in full compliance with their international law obligations. Furthermore, we call on all parties to build on this momentum to commit to full implementation of the ceasefire in good faith. Madam President, our worst fears have materialized a few days ago. The situation in both Gaza and West Bank has deteriorated beyond our gravest concerns. The past 48 hours we witnessed the devastating escalation. Last night, the IDF strike hit multiple homes in the middle of the night, killing and injuring sleeping families, mainly women and children. This follows Tuesday's attack, where many of the casualties remain unaccounted for and still under the ruins of destroyed buildings. These attacks bring more death and destruction to an already traumatized civilian populations. The past 3 weeks have seen a profound rollback of humanitarian progress, with the delivery of aid at the scale effectively ended since March 2nd. Gaza has been cut off from the life-saving supplies, including fuel, food, electricity, and medicine. We must reiterate, Israel, as occupying power, has a clear obligation under the international law to ensure the civilians have access to essential goods and services, including humanitarian assistance. Madam President, as we are all aware, the blockade coincided with the holy month of Ramadan, has worsened an already dire situation in Gaza. Reports indicate only 1 out of 10 people in Gaza have access to clean water, and the only desalination plant have been forced to close due to electricity cut. We categorically condemn the use of starvation as a weapon of war and reject any attempt to leverage humanitarian aid as bargaining chip in the ceasefire negotiations. Such tactics constitute clear violation of international humanitarian law and human dignity. Equally alarming is the escalating violence in the West Bank, including the continued expansion of illegal settlement activities and forced displacement of the Palestinians from their homes. The international community must stand united against any attempts to alter the demographic composition or forcibly displace Palestinians from their camps and cities or annex any part of the West Bank or Gaza under any pretext. Such actions will constitute a grave violation of international law and amount to ethnic cleansing. Madam President, looking to the future, the path is clear. First, we must ensure unimpeded humanitarian access and address a severe underfunding of humanitarian response efforts, which currently stands at the mere of 4% of required resources. Second, we call for an immediate renewal of the ceasefire and cessation of all hostilities. All parties should commit to the implementation of the Security Council Resolution 2735 in all its aspects and engage in good faith with mediationists from Egypt, Qatar, and United States toward the completion of the second and third phases of the ceasefire agreement. Last but not the least, the end of occupation and full recognition of free, sovereign, and independent Palestine with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital in accordance with the relevant resolutions remains the only sustainable option to resolve this long-standing conflict. Madam President, to conclude, we reaffirm an unwavering commitment to the international law and the principles enshrined in the UN Charter. The path forward requires our collective duty to immediate action to demand accountability, uphold justice, and work toward a future where Palestinian children no longer grow up under the shadow of war, but rather can live in peace, dignity, and prosperity in their land with their loved ones. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement. I give the floor now to the representative of Panama.
Gracias, señora Presidenta.
Thank you, Madam President.
Panamá saluda la
Panama
convocatoria de
hails
esta
the
sesión
convening of
y agradece al
meeting,
subsecretario general
and we
para
thank
Medio Oriente,
Assistant Secretary
Asia y
General
el
for the
Pacífico,
Middle East, Asia and
Mohamed
Pacific,
Khaled
Mr.
Chiari,
Mohamed Khaled
por la
Chiari,
información que ha
for
compartido.
the information he has shared.
Panamá
also
también desea
wishes
reconocer la
to
presencia
recognize the
y
presence
la
here and
valentía
the bravery
del señor
of
Eli
Mr.
Sharabi,
Eli Sharabi.
cuya dramática
His
experiencia
tragic experience
refleja el
reflects
profundo
the deep
sufrimiento
suffering
que este
that this
conflicto ha
conflict
impuesto
has
a tantas
imposed
familias.
upon so many
Su
families.
conmovedora
His
historia
moving story
es un testimonio
bears
del
witness
inmenso
to
costo
the
humano de esta
gargantuan human
tragedia.
cost of this tragedy.
Eli fue liberado
was
tras
released
16
after 16
largos y
long
dolorosos
and
meses
painful
de
months
cautiverio
of
en Gaza,
captivity in Gaza.
cuyos rigores nos acaba de
The
describir.
ordeal has just been
Pero,
described to us by him
lamentablemente,
in
no
detail.
pudo regresar a su
However,
casa con su
regrettably,
familia,
he wasn't able to go
porque
home to
su
his
hogar
family because
había
his
dejado de
home
existir.
had ceased to exist.
Sin que él lo supiera.
He didn't
Su
know that
esposa
that was the
y sus
case.
hijas
He didn't know that
habían
his
sido
wife and his
brutalmente
daughters had been
asesinadas
brutally
tras los
killed
inhumanos
during
ataques de
the
Hamas del
inhumane
7 de
Hamas
octubre.
attacks of the 7th of
Su hermano
October.
Yossi
His brother
sigue
Yossi
desaparecido.
remains missing.
Ese ataque
That attack
que marcó el inicio
marked
de esta
the
tragedia
beginning
humana
of this tragedy.
se cobró la vida de
It claimed the lives
aproximadamente
of approximately
1.200 personas
1,200
y resultó
individuals,
en el secuestro
and it
de
led
unas
to the abduction of
250
some
personas.
250
Al igual
individuals.
que Eli,
Like Eli,
59 rehenes siguen
59
privados de su
hostages
libertad en
continue
Gaza,
to be deprived of their
de los
liberty
cuales
in
se
Gaza,
estima que
of
solo
those, it is
24 de
believed that
ellos
only
permanecen
24
aún con vida,
are still alive.
haciéndole frente
And
a una realidad
they
igualmente dolorosa
live now
e incluso
in
peor.
an equally painful,
Estas
if not
personas
more painful,
no
reality.
pueden seguir
These
siendo
people
víctimas del
cannot
extremismo por
continue
parte de
to be
Hamas.
victims of Hamas's
Exigimos,
extremism. Once
una vez
again,
más,
once again,
la
we
liberación
demand the
inmediata e
immediate and
incondicional de
unconditional
todos los
release
rehenes
of all the
que
hostages.
debieron haber sido
They should
liberados
have
hace
been
tiempo
released a long
y
time
que
ago,
nunca
and they
debieron haber
never
sido
ought to have
aprehendidos.
been apprehended in the first place.
Así como Eli Sharabi perdió a su familia y su hogar,
Just as Eli
miles de
Sharabi
otras
lost his family
personas
and his
civiles en
home,
Gaza enfrentan
thousands
hoy
of other
una
civilians in
realidad
Gaza are
similar.
today facing a similar
Más de
reality.
49,000
More than
muertos y decenas de
49,000
miles
have
de
been
heridos.
killed and tens
Los
of
que han
thousands have been
sobrevivido lo
wounded.
hacen en
Those
medio
that
del
have
dolor y la
survived do
desesperación,
so mired in pain and
enfrentando cada
despair.
día la angustia
Every
de
day
no
they
tener
face
acceso
the
a
anguish
alimentos,
of not being
medicinas ni
able to
servicios
access
básicos.
food, medicines or basic
Esta severa
services. This
condición
bitter hardship
agrava cada día la
makes
vida
the
de miles de
lives
inocentes
of
que no
thousands of innocent
pidieron
people
ni
that
merecen
didn't
esta
ask
guerra.
for or deserve this war
Tras semanas de
even
relativa
harder
y
every
frágil
day.
calma
After weeks of
que
relative and
ofreció
fragile
un
calm,
paréntesis de esperanza,
which offered
la
an
interrupción
aside
del
of
alto
hope,
al
a
fuego
brief
el
period of
pasado
hope,
2 de marzo, ha sumido
was
nuevamente a la
broken
franja en una
by
espiral
the
de
ceasefire
violencia,
being broken on the 2nd of
causando
March.
un
That once
aumento
again plunged the
significativo
Gaza Strip into a
en el
spiral
número
of
de
violence,
víctimas
and that
que
significantly
profundiza la
spiked the number
prolongada
of
crisis
victims.
humanitaria
That
y ha
situation
puesto en
worsens
mayor
the
riesgo la
protracted
seguridad de la
humanitarian
vida de
crisis
los
and has
rehenes que
further
permanecen en
imperiled
Gaza.
the
No
lives
podemos
of the
olvidar
hostages that
a los
remain in Gaza. We
284
cannot
miembros
forget
del
the
personal humanitario de
284
Naciones
members
Unidas
of UN
que
humanitarian
han perdido
personnel
la vida en
that have
Gaza
lost their lives
desde el
in
7 de
Gaza
octubre de
since the 7th of October
2023.
2023.
Su valentía y
Their bravery
dedicación,
and devotion
demostradas al
shown
continuar su
as
labor
they
pese a los
continued
enormes
their
riesgos
work
que enfrentan a
despite the
diario,
grave risk they face on a
merecen
daily
nuestro
basis,
más
deserve our
profundo
deepest
reconocimiento.
gratitude.
Panamá
Panama
rinde homenaje a su
here pays
entrega
tribute to their
y reafirma su
self-sacrifice.
firme
We
apoyo
reaffirm our staunch
al
support
trabajo
for
invaluable
the
que
invaluable
realizan
work
en
that they
condiciones
continue
extremas
to perform
para
in
salvar
extreme
vidas y
conditions
aliviar
to
el
save lives
sufrimiento
and
humano.
mitigate human suffering.
Señora Presidente,
Madam President,
Panamá considera que el pueblo
believes that the
palestino en Gaza
people in Gaza
merece un liderazgo
deserve
comprometido
a
con la
leadership
paz,
that is
la
committed to
seguridad
peace,
y el respeto a los
security, and
derechos
respect
humanos.
for human rights.
Cualquier solución
Any
política
political
que
solution
permita
which
construir un
allows the
futuro
construction
sostenible
of a
para Gaza
sustainable future
debe
for
estar
Gaza
libre de la
must
influencia
remain
de
free
quienes
of the
promueven la
influence of those
violencia y el
promoting
extremismo.
violence and extremism.
Esta espiral de
This
violencia ha
spiral
sido
of
alimentada
violence
por años
has
de
only been
desconfianza y decisiones que han
fueled
dejado
by
de lado
years of
la
mistrust
búsqueda
and
genuina de
decisions
la
which have
paz.
cast aside the genuine
Cada
quest
vez
for
que se
peace.
impone el
Every time
extremismo
that
sobre el
extremism prevails
entendimiento,
over
se
understanding,
forma un
a
nudo que
knot is
estrangula con
formed,
fuerza el
a
sufrimiento
knot
de
which
quienes menos
brutally
culpa tienen,
represses the
las
suffering of those
poblaciones
least to blame,
civiles.
that is the
Ese
civilian
nudo,
population.
alimentado por años
This
de
knot,
desconfianza y
hardened by
posturas
years of
intransigentes,
mistrust and
se ha vuelto
entrenched
tan
immovable
rígido que
positions,
ahoga cualquier
has
posibilidad de
become so
acuerdos
difficult to
y agrava
untangle
aún
that
más
now
el
it
dolor de
sinks any
inocentes.
possibility of agreement and
Cuando
further
ese nudo
worsens the
revienta,
suffering of innocent
no lo hace
people.
en silencio,
When this rock of suffering
estalla con el dolor
explodes, it doesn't
desgarrador
do
de
so
madres,
silently.
padres,
The rock
hermanos
erupts
e
with the
hijos
heart-rending
que
pain
lloran
of
en la
mothers,
desesperación
fathers,
de una
brothers, and
pérdida
children that
irreparable.
desperately grieve an
Es el
irreparable
triste eco de
loss.
familias
This
enteras,
grief reverberates
tanto
throughout
israelíes
entire
como
families,
palestinas,
both Israeli and
que ven cómo
Palestinian
sus vidas
families.
se
They
desgarran
watch as
una
their
y otra
lives are
vez
torn apart
por la
time and
violencia
time
y el
again by the
odio que
violence
se
and the
resiste
hatred
a ceder.
which refuses to let up.
Señora Presidente,
Madam President,
este
this
conflicto
conflict
no
cannot
puede seguir el mismo
continue
camino.
to follow the same
Es
path.
imperativo
It
que
is
se demuestre
vital
voluntad política
that we see
constructiva que
constructive
afloje
political
esa
will,
tensión
political
y
will which
permita abrir
calms this
caminos para la
tension
paz.
and paves the
En
way
ese
for peace.
camino, Panamá
Along
tendrá
that path to
su
peace,
firme
Panama
respaldo a la
will
vía diplomática
staunchly
como la única
support
opción para
diplomacy as
restaurar el
the
alto al
only
fuego
option to
que
restore the
garantice la firme
ceasefire. The
protección de los
ceasefire which
civiles y
guarantees
el
robust
personal
protection for
humanitario,
civilians and
la
humanitarian
liberación
personnel.
inmediata e
The ceasefire will
incondicional
also
de todos
allow
los
the
rehenes
immediate and
y el acceso
unconditional
de ayuda
release
humanitaria
of
sin
hostages
restricciones.
and unfettered humanitarian
Lograrlo
access.
requiere el respeto y
Achieving those
cumplimiento de las
goals
resoluciones
requires
adoptadas
the
por este
respect for
Consejo
and compliance
y las
with this
normas
Council's
internacionales
resolutions, as well as
que
for
exigen
international
tanto la
norms,
liberación de los
which
rehenes
demand both
israelíes
the release of
como
Israeli
el acceso
hostages and
humanitario a
humanitarian
Gaza.
access to
Muchas
Gaza.
gracias.
Thank you.
I thank the representative of Panama for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of China.
主席，
President,
我感谢加利副
I
秘书长
thank
的通报。
ASG
Chiari for
我
the
也感
briefing.
谢沙拉比先生的发
I
言。
also thank Mr. Sharabi for
我
his
们对你的
statement.
遭遇
We express
和
our
失去亲人
sympathy
的
for
痛苦
what you have been
表示
through
同情。
and your pain of losing loved ones.
15个月的冲突
50 months of
使
conflict
加沙
have
面
made
目全
Gaza
非，
unrecognizable
使许多人
and
遭受了
caused
难以承受的痛苦。
unimaginable suffering upon many people.
我们衷心希望
We
所有
sincerely
的痛
hope
苦
that
都可
all
以
that
结束，
suffering will come to an end,
希望所有人质
that all
和被
hostages
扣押人员
and those held
尽快获释，
captive will be promptly
希望
released,
加沙
and that
恢复和平。
peace will be restored in Gaza.
但局势发展
Yet the developments in the
事与愿违。
situation have proven otherwise.
以色列从3月17日开始
Since March the
实
17th,
施
Israel
大
has
规模
begun
空
to
袭，
carry out large-scale
在加
airstrikes
沙重新
and resumed
挑起战火，
hostilities in Gaza,
使停火协议崩
leading
溃，
to the collapse of the ceasefire
制造了
agreement and
更多的
causing
痛苦
more
和死亡。
suffering and deaths.
中方对
China
此表示严重关切，
expresses serious concern over this.
把加沙置于炮火威胁之下。
Putting Gaza
恐怕
under
不会
the
让人
threat
质
of
更安
gunfire
全。
will probably not make the
事实上，
hostages safer.
我
In
们听
fact,
到一些人质家
we
属
hear that
也
some
很担
families of
心
the hostages
重
are
开
also
战火
greatly worried
将让
that
人
the
质更
resumption
加
of
危险，
fighting will put the hostages
希
in
望
greater
维持
danger
停火，
and hope that
以利于
the
人质
ceasefire will
早
be
日回家。
maintained, which would be conducive to the early return of the hostages to their
残
homes.
酷事实已经证明
The，brutal
实现
reality
持久停火
has shown
是
that
拯救
achieving
生
a
命、
permanent
让人
ceasefire
质回
is
家
the
的最
best
好
way to
方式。
save lives and get the hostages
我
home.
们敦促以色列
We urge
放弃
Israel
使用武力的执
to
念，
abandon
停止对加沙的
the
军事行动
obsession。with the use of force and stop its military
希
operation
望
on
停
Gaza.
火协议的保障国
We hope that the
秉持
guarantors of the
公正、
ceasefire
负
agreement
责任
will
的态
adopt
度，
a just and
采取行
responsible
动，
attitude
推动
and take
停火协议
action
3阶段
to
连贯落
promote
实，
the
在加沙实
continuous
现持久
implementation
停
of the
火。
three-phased ceasefire towards a permanent ceasefire
加
in
沙民
Gaza.
众在躲避战火
The
的同时，
civilians, the
正在
people
遭
in
受
Gaza,
严峻的
while
人道
fleeing
灾
the
难
fighting, are
和
yet
流离
again
失所
being
之苦。
subject to
以色
humanitarian
列先后切
catastrophe
断加沙
and
物资准入
displacement.
和
Israel
电
has
力供应，
successfully cut off
并在
access
多
for
地
aid
发布
supplies
强
into
制
Gaza
撤
and
离
the
令，
power supply and issued
这是对
orders of forced
200万平
evacuation
民
from
的
multiple
实施的集体
locations
惩罚，
in Gaza. This is
没有任
collective
何
punishment
正当
for
理
the
由。
2 million civilians for which there
禁
is
止人道
no
物资进入加
justification.
沙，可能也
Denying
会使剩余的人质被剥夺
humanitarian
生存下去
supplies
的
into
基
Gaza
本需求。
can deprive the remaining hostages of
以
their
色列作为占领方，
needs
应
to
该履行
survive.
国际人道法义务，
Israel, as the occupying
立即
power,
解
should
除封
fulfill
锁，
its
全
obligations
面恢
under
复加沙
IHL,
的人道物资准入。
immediately lift the blockade
我们也
and
重
fully
申
restore
反
access
对
for
任何
humanitarian
针对
supplies
联合
into
国人
Gaza.
员
We
和人道
also
工作者的袭
oppose
击。
any attacks on UN personnel and
主席，
humanitarians.
每个人的生命
President,
都是宝
the
贵的。
life of every individual is
巴勒斯坦人
precious.
民
The
和以色列人
Palestinian
民
people and the Israeli
享有
people have
平等的
equal
生存权
rights
利
to
和发
survival
展权
and
利。
development.
巴以冲突
The
几十年循
decades-long
环往复，
cycles of Palestinian
让
and
双方
Israeli
几代人
conflict
生
have
活在阴影之
caused
中。
generations on both sides to live under the shadow.
只有全面落实两国方
Only by
案，
fully
实
implementing
现
the
巴勒斯坦
two-state
独立
solution
建
and
国，
achieving the
实现
independent
巴以
statehood
两
of
国和
Palestine
平共处，
and
才
achieving
能持久保障
peaceful
巴勒斯坦人
coexistence
民
between the two
和以
states of
色列人
Palestine
民
and
的安
Israel,
全和福祉。
can we ensure the
我们呼吁
lasting
国际社
security
会
and well-being of the
加大努力，
Palestinians and Israelis?
推进
We
落
call
实
upon
两
the
国方案的
international
政治
community
进
to
程。
step up efforts in advancing the political process of the two-state
中方
solution.
将发挥建设性作
China
用，
will play a
为恢
constructive
复
role
中东地区和平，
to
实现巴勒斯坦
restore
问题
peace in the
全
Middle
面、
East
公正、
and achieve
持
a
久解决。
comprehensive, just,
做
and
出
lasting
不懈努力。
solution to the Palestinian question.
谢谢主席。
Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I also thank A.S. Chiari for his detailed briefing. I also thank Mr. Eli Sharabi for your powerful testimony to your unspeakable suffering. And I'd like to convey my government, the Republic of Korea's deepest condolences for your loss of your beloved ones. Madam President, we still vividly remember the horror that shocked the entire globe on October 7, 2023, when a peaceful holiday morning in southern Israel suddenly changed into a nightmare. More than 1,200 Israeli citizens, including children, were brutally murdered by Hamas, and 251 innocent Israelis were forcibly kidnapped. These horrific terrorist attacks, unjustifiable under any excuse, left unforgettable trauma to Israelis. We once again repeat our strong condemnation on the terrorist attacks by Hamas on that dark day. As we speak now, 59 hostages, living or dead, are still held in Gaza. And we are frightened that more than 30 out of 59 hostages are presumed dead. The taking of hostages, as well as degrading treatment to them, is strictly prohibited under international humanitarian law. However, it is outrageous that hostages held by Hamas have experienced serious and extreme mistreatment, including being bound, starvation, and sexual violence. These indefensible crimes must be held accountable. There can be no impunity. Last month, we heard in this chamber another powerful testimony by the former hostage Ms. Noa Argamani. In her harrowing statement, she told us that the lives of the Israeli people cannot go on without those hostages still held in Gaza. Talking about her partner, who is still held by Hamas, she stressed that the deal must go on in full. We call on all parties to this conflict to pay the utmost attention to her desperate voice. With the renewed offensive in Gaza that started on Tuesday, we now hear once again the clear outcries of hostage families and released hostages, including Mr. Sharabi, who emphasized again and again, bring the remaining hostages home. Madam President, while we demand unconditional and immediate release of all hostages, we note that the most realistic way to ensure their safety and freedom is through the deal to secure the release of hostages and ceasefire in Gaza. Thus, we call on Israel to exercise restraint. Hamas must not endanger the lives of Palestinian civilians, and all parties should faithfully return to negotiations. The Republic of Korea appeals to all parties to this conflict to prioritize alleviating the suffering of civilians and protecting them. We commend the ongoing efforts by mediators, Qatar, Egypt, and the United States, and count on them once again for securing the ceasefire and release of all hostages. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, I would like to thank ASG Khaled Khiari for his briefing. We also listened carefully to the representative of the civil society. Consistent with the universal human rights, no civilian, irrespective of their background, should endure suffering. Every innocent life matters. Consistency is a fundamental principle in international relations. A selective, cherry-picking attitude toward international law, particularly international humanitarian law, is not acceptable. For a country to uphold its international obligations and contribute positively to global stability, it must obey the legal frameworks that govern human rights and humanitarian activities. Algeria, as a serious member of the international community, firmly respects and upholds all its international obligations. We firmly believe that the law is the cornerstone of international law. Without adherence to international law, we risk descending into a jungle where might make right and injustice prevails. Regrettably, this is precisely what we witness today. In the occupied Palestinian territories, what we see unfolding before us is not the rule of law, but rather an environment where no rules are respected and basic human dignity is disregarded. Humanitarian access, you can block it. Children, women, and elderly, you can massacre them. And workers, UN staff, journalists, and medical staff, you can target and kill them. These are the new rules that have been established in Gaza. Madam President, since October the 7th, members of this Council have constantly adopted resolutions calling for the release of all hostages. We have easily reached agreement on this matter, but we have failed to achieve one crucial call: the immediate and permanent ceasefire. Today, this is the cause of the suffering endured by all people in Gaza. The failure to impose this essential measure prolonged the pain and devastation in Gaza, the pain on all sides. Madam President, international humanitarian and human rights law guarantees the rights of individuals in captivity, ensuring their dignity and human treatment. Moreover, the principle of non-reciprocity, a cornerstone of international humanitarian law, prohibits revenge or retaliation. Even during times of conflict, the protection of human dignity must remain a priority. Suffering cannot justify another suffering. However, it is with great regret that we observe the Israeli occupying powers' blatant disregard for these fundamental principles. To illustrate this, first, over 9,500 Palestinians are currently detained in Israeli prisons, with more than 3,400 held under administrative detention, without charges or trial. Why are these individuals arrested? What legal ground justify their detention? Second, since October 7th, the Israeli occupying authorities have cut off all cooperation with the ICRC, rendering detainees disappeared. Third, one of the most grotesque violations involves the Israeli practice of holding the bodies of dead Palestinians. Before October 7th, the number of such bodies was estimated at approximately 400, some dating back as far as the 80s. Today, the number exceeds 600. Madam President, the international community must come together to ensure full compliance with international law. Double standards and selective enforcement of these principles are unacceptable. The law must be upheld universally, without exception, to protect the rights of all individuals, regardless of their nationality or the conflict they find themselves in. Only by holding all parties to the same legal standards can we hope to bring an end to the suffering and build a just and lasting peace. I thank you.
Thank the representative of Algeria for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, we thank Assistant Secretary General Khalid Keri for his briefing to the Council this morning. We have also heard with sympathy the statement of Mr. Sharabi and commiserate with him on the loss of his family. Madam President, civilians have been the central victim of the current war in Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territories. Hostage-taking is prohibited under international law and constitutes a violation of fundamental humanitarian principles. The protection of civilians must be ensured in full compliance with international humanitarian law, including the Fourth Geneva Convention. However, international law must be applied uniformly, universally, and consistently. The issue of the humanitarian violations must encompass the plight of the thousands of Palestinians who have suffered during this war. We cannot forget the thousands of Palestinians, including women and children, who remain arbitrarily detained, subjected to torture, and held in inhumane conditions in Israeli prisons. Many have lost their lives due to mistreatment and medical neglect. Our colleague from Algeria has just outlined this suffering of Palestinian detainees. The international community must not turn a blind eye to their suffering. Justice and human rights cannot be applied selectively. For illustration, the recent report of the Commission of Inquiry stated that Israel's systematic use of sexual, reproductive, and other forms of gender-based violence since October 7, 2023, and it found, and I quote, Israeli forces have committed the crime against humanity of persecution based on gender. Madam President, we must turn to ending the suffering in Gaza, in the occupied Palestinian territories, and in the region. The ceasefire agreement facilitated by Egypt, Qatar, and the United States offered a glimmer of hope. It led to the release of hostages and temporarily alleviated the suffering of the Palestinian people. Yet, tragically, this opportunity was sabotaged by the political interests of some Israeli politicians who prioritized their survival through the continuation of the war. We condemn the resumption of Israel's attacks on Gaza and the indiscriminate killing of Palestinian civilians through bombardments through the air as well as artillery. We also deplore the killing of the UNOPS official and the UNRWA members and commiserate with their families. And we must ask whether this resumption of war is good for the hostages. Is it good for the Palestinians? Certainly not. The ongoing attacks, blockade, mass displacement, and relentless bombardment have created an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. The Palestinians are being killed indiscriminately and with impunity. This is not the way to secure the release of the hostages. Madam President, Pakistan reiterates its urgent call for the full and immediate resumption and implementation of the ceasefire agreement in all its phases. This must include permanent cessation of hostilities, the complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza, unrestricted humanitarian access, and a comprehensive reconstruction plan for Gaza. We support the full implementation of Security Council Resolution 2735. This would be the best way to secure the release of the hostages. Madam President, while Pakistan supports all efforts to alleviate human suffering and ensure the humane treatment of all civilians, we must not lose sight of the root cause of this endless cycle of violence and suffering. Israel's illegal occupation of the Palestinian territories, its persistent violations of international law, and its indiscriminate military actions against the innocent and helpless people of Gaza continues to fuel instability and conflict in the Middle East. We saw some hope in the proposed Arab and OIC plan for recovery and reconstruction of Gaza. It offered a realistic path to peace. We believe that this path must be reinstated. A just and lasting peace can only be achieved through the revival of a credible and irreversible political process towards a two-state solution, leading to the establishment of an independent, sovereign Palestinian state within the pre-1967 borders, with Al-Quds al-Sharif as its capital. The upcoming June conference, co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia, presents an important opportunity to advance the peaceful resolution of the Palestinian question and to implement the two-state solution in accordance with international law and UN resolutions. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement. I give the floor now to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank Assistant Secretary General Chiari for his briefing and Mr. Sharabi for moving account of his horrific experience. We are glad to see you well, and we express our condolences for your loss. Colleagues, those who follow Council's deliberation in details will have noticed that Slovenia's tone evolved. But we have always, every single time, advocated for respect for international law, the unconditional release of hostages, the protection of Palestinian civilians, an immediate ceasefire, and unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza. We have consistently claimed that people trapped in Gaza cannot continue to endure this terrible suffering, let them be Israeli hostages or Palestinian civilians. We always defended Council's action, also to ensure release of hostages. I want to recall the Resolution 2728, drafted by the 10 elected members and adopted by this Council last March. It contains a clear demand, quote, for immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, end of quote. Colleagues, we once again condemn terrorist attacks on October 7 and hostage-taking by means of those who died in custody, in captivity, in particular, the Bibas family. We deeply regret that the negotiations to secure the release of the rest of hostages have not continued, and the process of finding a peaceful solution through dialogue has stalled. Will cutting electricity, halting humanitarian aid, or intensifying military operations truly bring the remaining hostages home alive? Or will that put them in additional danger? We disagree that the return to fighting was a necessity. War is never a necessity, but a choice. There is no military solution to any conflict, and neither is to the one in Gaza. It is only peace that would bring hostages home sooner. the best option for them to enjoy freedom again is respecting the ceasefire agreement in line with Resolution 2735. We supported and joined the appeal by hostage Noah Argamani made here in the Council chamber a month ago for the deal to go on in full and completely in all the stages. We therefore once again thank and appeal to mediators, the United States, Egypt, and Qatar, to continue their tireless engagement. And we urge Hamas and Israel to return to negotiations table in good faith. Madam President, I would like to extend our condolences to all families and friends of hostages that have lost their loved ones. All remaining hostages need to be released immediately. This is our demand that we continue to voice since October 7. Hostages should be treated with humanity and with respect for the inherent human dignity, including during their release. The ICRC must be granted access to them. I repeat, suffering of hostages should never be a bargaining chip. Neither should humanitarian aid ever be weaponized. Finally, we fundamentally disagree with the notion that the loudest voices on human rights lost their voice. Not all of us. Slovenia proudly stands for human rights and protection of all civilians in all situations. And with this in mind, we cannot accept that the war in Gaza continues to be fought by sacrificing lives of Israeli hostages, Palestinian civilians, as well as humanitarian workers. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Assistant Secretary General Khalid Kiari for his important briefing. I also thank Mr. Eli Sharabi for his bravery in sharing his compelling personal and tragic testimony with us. Our deepest condolences on the loss of your family. We acknowledge the letters dated 14th and 18th March 2025 from the Permanent Representative of Israel to the United Nations regarding the plight of the hostages and their tragic humanitarian situation. As this Council focuses on hostage-taking today, one undeniable reality of this ongoing conflict in Gaza Strip is its devastating toll on civilians, both in Israel and in Gaza. Since the attack on 7th October 2023, hostages and civilians have endured extreme suffering with severe humanitarian consequences. The unacceptable attack resulted in the abduction by Hamas and other armed groups of 250 individuals, men, women, and children, ranging in age from 9 months to 85 years. Categorically, this act constitutes a grave violation of international law. Article 34 of the Fourth Geneva Convention explicitly prohibits hostage-taking. This prohibition has crystallized into a rule of customary international law, as recognized by the International Committee of the Red Cross in a study on customary international humanitarian law under Rule 96. While the first phase of the ceasefire led to the release of 38 hostages, some of whom tragically perished in captivity, we remain deeply concerned that 59 individuals are still being held hostage. Their condition, medical needs, and access to humanitarian aid are unknown, with the ICRC still being denied access. In light of the unimaginable pain and suffering endured by hostages and their families, Sierra Leone reiterates its firm and unequivocal demand for their immediate and unconditional release, as previously called for by this Council in Resolution 2712, 2720, 2728, and 2735. We note the endorsement in this Council in Resolution 2735 of the agreed terms for the release of Palestinian detainees, and also call for the release of thousands of Palestinians detained in the State of Israel without trial, access, or proper care, in violation of international law and their fundamental rights and dignity. We emphasize that the release of hostages and detainees must be conducted with dignity, and the ICRC must be granted immediate access in accordance with international humanitarian law to provide medical and humanitarian assistance. As we extend our deepest sympathies to the families of all victims of this conflict, including the hostages, we stress the importance of investigating violations, including allegations of mistreatment and abuse of hostages and detainees. Accountability must be ensured for all grave violations committed in the context of this conflict, including those arising from the ongoing occupation of Palestinian territories. Madam President, as the Security Council convenes to address yet another tragic aspect of its decades-long conflict, the Palestinian struggle for self-determination, and the 7th October 2023 escalation, reports indicate that the Israeli defensive forces have carried out pre-dawn attacks in northern and southern Gaza, killing over 70 Palestinians, including women and children. This comes just one day after more than 400 Palestinians, including 183 children, were killed. We must continue to collectively work to end this conflict. This layer of tragedies, we must support efforts to protect civilians in Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank, and strive relentlessly towards a peaceful and sustainable resolution of this conflict. The recent post-ceasefire escalation of violence has already resulted in hundreds of casualties, and continued diplomatic engagement is essential to return to the ceasefire agreement and address outstanding issues. In closing, we must reiterate that hostage-taking is a grave violation of international law, and it triggers responsibilities for armed groups, states, and the international community. It demands immediate action for the protection, release, and legal accountability of all those involved. We also reiterate our call for a just and lasting political solution to this conflict, the immediate and full restoration of humanitarian aid access, respect for international law, and the protection of civilians and humanitarian workers, and a resolution that ensures security and coexistence for both Israelis and Palestinians, living side by side in peace and tranquility. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Thank you, Madam President. I also wish to thank ASG Khaled Khiari for his briefing, as well as Mr. Eli Sharabi for his testimony here today. Madam President, 531 days have passed since Hamas launched a brutal terrorist attack on Israel. Greece immediately condemned this attack, as well as the cruel treatment of all hostages kept in captivity in terrible and inhumane conditions. Today, 59 hostages remain still in Hamas's captivity, 24 of whom are believed to be alive. The tragic story of Eli Sharabi is a sheer reminder that this war must end now. We extend our deepest and most heartfelt condolences to him for the tragic loss of beloved family members, as well as to the families of victims and hostages. We reiterate our call for all hostages to be released immediately and unconditionally. Dramatic stories, like the one of Noah Ragamanis, whose partner is still in captivity, are mere reflections of the scale of pain still endured by survivors in captivity and their loved ones. Likewise, the heartbreaking fate of the Bibas family highlights the urgent need to bring the agony and suffering to an end. Our thoughts remain with them. Madam President, the long-awaited ceasefire and hostage release agreement in Gaza was a great example of what could be achieved through political will and opportunity to replace despair with hope for a better future. Hope on the horizon became visible when Israeli families were given the chance to finally rejoin their loved ones and Palestinian people were finally able to stop counting their dead. In this respect, we are very concerned with the resumption of hostilities in Gaza and the high toll on civilians. It is necessary to resume negotiations for the ceasefire renewal immediately so as to ensure the release of remaining hostages and to protect the lives of the civilian population in Gaza. Madam President, the world cannot or should not forget neither the lives taken as a result of the horrendous terrorist attack on October 7, nor the lives of the remaining hostages. At the same time, we cannot or should not forget that the war in Gaza has left behind thousands of Palestinians dead, injured, separated from their families, and internally displaced. The humanitarian crisis on the ground cannot be ignored. Millions are in urgent need of primary health services, education, and shelter. Safe, unconditional, massive, and unhindered delivery of humanitarian aid at scale to the people of Gaza must be ensured. We share the grief for the UNOP staff member who died during the strike at the UN gas house in Gaza and offer our condolences to his family in the UN. Border crossing points must remain open. UNRWA's role should not be undermined. Civilians and humanitarian workers must be protected in line with international humanitarian law. Madam President, the political process must be revitalized with the aim of achieving a two-state solution according to the relevant Security Council resolution, while recognizing the right of Israel to exist in peace and security. In this vein, we look forward to an international conference to be held in June here in New York under the stewardship of France and Saudi Arabia as co-chairs. We welcome regional efforts to cohere around a single plan for the next phase in Gaza, and we stand ready to support and develop these ideas further. The Arab plan for the reconstruction of Gaza is a constructive proposal on the table and could help accelerate discussions on reconstruction, post-conflict planning, and on the day after. It is a good starting point, which requires further engagement with Egypt and other key Arab players. Madam President, the circle of violence must end now, and the hostages must be released without delay. It is evident by now that this conflict has no military solution. As we have stressed before, there can be no day-after scenario for the Gaza Strip with Hamas in power or in any position to threaten Israel. We cannot change the past, but we can start now and lay the foundation for the future. The suffering of both sides must come to an end. Neither the hostages and their families nor the Palestinians can afford to pull back from the ceasefire agreement. The deal must hold. Therefore, it is crucial for the parties to return to the table of negotiations and proceed to the next phase in good faith. Time is running out. The time to act is now. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Madam President.
Благодарим помощника
We'd like to
генсекретаря
thank
Халида Хияри
the ASG,
за
Mr.
обстоятельный
Khaled
брифинг
Khiari,
по
for
ситуации,
his substantive
складывающейся
briefing
вокруг
about the
заложников,
situation
удерживаемых в
surrounding
секторе Газа.
the hostages detained in the Gaza Strip.
Со скорбью в сердце выслушали
Our hearts
трагическую
were filled
историю
with sorrow
Эли
as we
Шараби,
listened to the tragic story
потерявшего
of
всю свою
Mr.
семью.
Eli Sharabi, who lost his entire
Подобная
family.
жестокость не имеет
Such
оправданий.
brutality can have no
Выражаем вам наши
justification.
искренние
We
соболезнования.
express to you, Mr. Sharabi, our heartfelt
Скорбим
condolences.
также по всем без
We
исключения
also
погибшим в
grieve
результате продолжающейся
over
без малого
all
18
those who
месяцев
died as a
эскалации.
result of the escalation which has been
Этот
going on for over
нескончаемый
18
порочный
months now.
круг
This
насилия
endless,
необходимо
vicious
наконец
cycle of
разорвать.
violence needs to end at last.
Невыносимые страдания
The
мирных жителей
unbearable
в зоне
suffering of peaceful
палестино-израильского
civilians
конфликта
in
не могут
the
никого оставить
area of the
равнодушным.
Israeli-Palestinian conflict leave
Именно
no one
поэтому
indifferent.
19
For that
января
very reason,
международное
on the 19th
сообщество
of January, the international
приветствовало
community
установление режима
welcomed the
прекращения огня
establishment of a
между
ceasefire
Израилем и
between
Хамас,
Israel and Hamas.
которая не только приостановила спираль
This not
насилия,
only
унесшую жизни более
stopped the
49
spiral of
тысяч человек,
violence which claimed
но и
the
привело
lives
к
of over
долгожданному
49,000
освобождению
people,
удерживаемых в
but
Газе
also
заложников
resulted
и
in the
содержащихся в
long-awaited
израильских
release
тюрьмах
of
палестинцев.
hostages held in Gaza and of Palestinians held in Israeli
В ходе
prisons.
первого этапа сделки Израилю
During
было
phase
передано
one of
25
the deal,
заложников, а
25
также 8
hostages were
тел
handed
в обмен
over
на
to
почти
Israel, as well as 8
1800
bodies, in
палестинских
exchange
заключенных.
for almost
Кроме того,
1,800
за 42 дня
Palestinian
тишины
detainees.
у жителей
Also,
Газы,
during the
включая
40-day
остающихся
truce,
заложников
Gazans
израильтян,
and
появилась
Israelis
надежда
still
на спасение.
held hostage there began
Доступ
to
в
harbor
анклав
hopes
был
of salvation.
разблокирован.
Access to the
Гуманитарная
enclave
деятельность
was unblocked,
активизировалась, и
humanitarian
структуры
activities were
ООН
ramped up,
рапортовали
and
о наращивании
UN
гумпоставок
entities
на территории
reported
анклава.
that humanitarian deliveries to the enclave
Весь мир
were
вздохнул с
increased.
облегчением.
The world breathed a sigh of relief.
Однако с приближением
yet,
даты окончания первого этапа договоренности
end of
о
phase
прекращении
one
огня,
drew closer,
перспективы дальнейшей
The
реализации сделки
prospects
оказались
of
под
the
вопросом.
further implementation of the deal were called into
С первого
question.
дня перемирия
Since day
руководство
one
Израиля
of the
последовательно
truce,
наращивало воинственную риторику
the
при
Israeli
сохранении
leadership
присутствия
consistently
формирований
stepped up its
армии обороны
bellicose
Израиля в секторе.
rhetoric while maintaining an idea of presence in
Переход
the
ко
strip.
второй фазе сделки,
The switch to
предполагающий
phase two of the
постоянное
deal,
прекращение огня и
entailing a
освобождение
permanent
всех
ceasefire and the
остающихся в
release
Газе
of all
заложников,
remaining hostages in Gaza,
видимо, даже не рассматривался.
is not even something the
Вместо этого
Israeli
израильские
leadership
власти, вопреки
entertained.
достигнутым при
Instead,
помощи
the
посредников
Israeli authorities,
договоренностям,
despite
упорно
the
продвигали
deal
идеи
reached thanks to the
исключительно
mediators,
технического
have
продления
stubbornly
перемирия
been
в целях
promoting the
возвращения
idea of a
всех
purely
заложников.
technical extension of the ceasefire so as to secure the return of all hostages.
Ситуация долгое время
For a long
оставалась
time, the
подвешенной.
situation was up in the
Однако
air.
окно возможностей
Yet
на
the window of
перезапуск комплексного
opportunity
процесса
to
мирного регулирования
restart
все-таки
a
захлопнулось
comprehensive
18
peaceful settlement
марта,
process was slammed
когда
shut
авиация
on the
армии
18th of
обороны
March
Израиля возобновила
when the
авиаудары
IDF
по
resumed
территории сектора,
airstrikes on the
в
strip.
результате чего
As a
были
result,
убиты более
over
420 человек, в том
420
числе
people
сотрудники
died,
ЮНОПС.
including a UNOPS
Еще 5
staffer.
сотрудников ООН получили
5
ранения.
more UN
Как
personnel
заявил
were
генсекретарь
wounded.
ООН,
As the
общее число
UNSG
погибших 7
stated,
октября
the death
2023
toll since
года
the
ООНовцев
7th of October
составило по меньшей мере
2023, that is among
280
UN
человек.
staff, is at least 280 people.
Присоединяемся к
We
решительному
join our
осуждению
voice to
генсекретарем
the decisive
нападений на
condemnation
персонал
by
Всемирной
the Secretary
организации
General
и его
of
призыву к
attacks on
проведению
UN
полноценного
staff and his
расследования данного
call for a
инцидента.
full investigation into this incident.
Госпожа председатель,
Madam President,
мы с глубоким
we
сожалением
deeply
восприняли
regret
возобновление
the
Израилем
resumption
военных
by
действий
Israel
в
of
секторе Газа.
military operations in the Gaza Strip.
Причем, насколько мы можем судить,
And, as far as we can tell,
речь идет не только о воздушных
what we're
налетах,
talking about here is
но и о
not just
наземной
airstrikes,
операции.
but also a ground operation.
Решительно
We
осуждаем любые
decisively
действия,
condemn any
которые ведут к
actions
гибели мирных
leading to the
граждан
death
и
of
дальнейшему
civilians
разрушению
and
социальной
the
инфраструктуры.
further destruction of social infrastructure.
Обескураживает и поступающая
We are
информация о
particularly
неизбирательных
disheartened by
атаках
reports
израильской
about
авиации
indiscriminate
к
attacks
району Маваси,
waged by the
ранее
Israeli Air Force on
объявленному израильтянами
Mawasi, an
гуманитарной
area
зоной
which
безопасности для
Israel had
эвакуации с
previously
территории анклава
designated as
всех
a humanitarian
нуждающихся в
safe
неотложной
zone
помощи.
where all those needing emergency medical care could be evacuated to.
В итоге, сегодня мы
As a
узнали
result,
и о
today
возобновлении обстрелов
we
из
heard
Газа израильских
about,
городов, включая Тель-Авив,
Israeli cities being
что
shelled
было
from
весьма
Gaza,
предсказуемо,
including Tel Aviv.
ведь
This was
насилие
predictable,
порождает насилие.
given that violence breeds violence.
Параллельно Израиль
In parallel,
возобновил полную
Israel
блокаду сектора
resumed a
Газа,
full-blown
прекратив
blockade
подачу
on the
воды
strip,
и электроэнергии,
stopping supplies of water
несмотря
and
на
electricity,
очевидную угрозу для
despite
жизни и
this
безопасности тех, кто
obviously
там
posing a threat
находится,
to the
в
life
том
and
числе
safety of all
остающихся в
those
заложниках
who
израильтян.
remain there, including Israeli hostages.
Такое решение
Such a decision
представляет собой грубейшее
is a
нарушение
particularly
международного
flagrant
гуманитарного
violation of
права
international
и
humanitarian
может
law
трактоваться как
and
военное
can be
преступление.
characterized as a war crime.
Проблема выживания, с
The
которой
issue of
сталкиваются
survival, which
палестинцы,
Palestinians are
осложняется
being confronted
критической
with, is
ситуацией вокруг
complicated by the
функционирования
critical
БАФОР,
situation
которая является
facing
ключевой
UNRWA
структурой
operations.
по
UNRWA being
комплексному
a key
содействию
entity
палестинцам.
for comprehensive support being provided to the Palestinians.
Закручивая гайки
By
в
tightening
секторе
the
Газа,
screws in the Gaza
руководство
Strip,
Израиля
the Israeli
одновременно
leadership is
продолжает неправомерные
simultaneously
шаги,
taking
включая военную
illegal
операцию
steps,
на
including the
западном
military
берегу реки
operation
Иордан.
in the West Bank.
Завтра у нас будет возможность
Tomorrow,
обсудить
we
эту
will have
тему
an
подробно.
opportunity to discuss this topic in greater detail.
Госпожа председатель,
Madam President,
сегодня мы с крайним разочарованием
today we were
вынуждены констатировать,
acutely
что прекращение огня,
disappointed to see that the
которого мы
ceasefire,
все так
which
долго
we had
добивались,
all worked
оказалось
towards for so
неустойчивым.
long, turned out to be unsustainable.
Сложно говорить о его
It's
дальнейших
hard to
перспективах,
discuss its
когда
future
израильское
prospects
военно-политическое
when
руководство
the
открыто
Israeli military and
заявляет о
political
намерении
leadership
действовать
is
против
openly
Хамас с
announcing its
возрастающей
intent to
силой
use
и
mounting
вести
force
дальнейшие
against
переговоры
Hamas
по сделке
and
исключительно
to
под огнем.
hold future deal negotiations exclusively under
Выбор
fire.
в пользу войны, похоже, уже
It would
сделан.
appear
И
that they've
кто
already
знает, сколько
made the
новых
choice
жертв
in favor
ждет
of war.
Палестину и
Who
Израиль
knows
впереди.
how many new victims await Palestine and Israel in the future?
Полагаем, что
We
хрупкость только
believe
что
that the
нарушена
frigate
еще и тем,
flouted is
что Совет
also explained by the
Безопасности
fact that
ООН
the
с
Security
самого
Council,
начала
since the very beginning,
было мало что известно насчет
the
деталей
Council knew
переговорного
very
процесса
little
по
about the
сделке.
details of
Ведь
the
Совет был
negotiation
изначально
paving the
от
way for the
нее
deal.
целенаправленно
Since the
отсечен,
outset, the
и
Security
весь
Council was
акцент
deliberately
делался на
cut off
усилиях
from this
других
process,
посредников.
and the entire emphasis was placed on other
Соответственно, оказался
intermediaries.
невостребован и весь
Hence,
имеющийся
the
у ООН для
entire
этого специальный
specialized UN
инструментарий,
toolkit
задействование
wasn't
которого
needed,
могло бы
although the
обеспечить
use
устойчивый
of this
характер
toolkit
прекращения
could
огня.
have made the ceasefire sustainable.
Важно, чтобы те, кто
It's
будет
important
работать
for
над
those who are going
восстановлением
to be
перемирия
working
в
on the
секторе,
restoration
отдавали
of the
себе в этом
ceasefire
отчет.
in the strip to be cognizant of this fact.
Несмотря на новое обострение
Despite the new
палестино-израильского конфликта, мы
escalation of the
убеждены, что
Israeli-Palestinian
его
conflict, we
дипломатическое
stand
решение не
convinced
только
that a
возможно, но и
diplomatic
является
solution is not only
единственной
possible,
реалистичной
but that
опцией.
is the only realistic option.
Призываем
We
израильскую и
call
палестинскую
on the
стороны
Israeli
при
and Palestinian
содействии
parties,
посредников
with
вернуться за стол
assistance
переговоров
of
с целью выработки
intermediaries, to go
взаимоприемлемого
back to the
компромиссного
negotiations
решения
table to craft
проблемы
a mutually
удерживаемых лиц,
acceptable compromise solution
возвращения к режиму прекращения огня
to the
и
issue of
возобновлению
detained
полноценного
persons, a
гуманитарного
return
доступа.
to the ceasefire, and a resumption of comprehensive humanitarian
Это
access.
позволило бы
This could
обеспечить
allow
устойчивую
for
нормализацию в секторе
a
Газа
sustainable
и запустить
normalization in the Gaza
полномасштабное
Strip
восстановление
and for the
палестинского
kickstarting of
анклава.
a full-scale reconstruction of the
Уверены,
enclave.
что
We
это
stand
именно
convinced
то, чего
that
желает
this this is precisely what peaceful Palestinians, as well as the relatives and loved ones of hostages that remain in Gaza, wish for, including Mr. Maxim Herkin, who was born in the Donbass. It's important for all regional players and the international community as a whole to work towards this end. The process of Israeli-Palestinian settlement should return to the political track so as to satisfy all of Israel's lawful security concerns, as well as Palestinians' aspirations to their own state within 1967 borders. We stand ready to pursue this objective here in the Security Council, together with all those who share in this approach. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Madam Chair, Madam President, actually, thank you for convening today's meeting. I thank Assistant Secretary General Chiari for his briefing, and I take this opportunity to extend to him and the UN family our deepest condolences on the killing of the 6 UNOPS and UNRWA workers over these last few days. I also commend Mr. Sharabi for his courage in sharing his experience with us today and commiserate with him on the loss of his loved ones in such tragic circumstances. Madam President, at the outset, Guyana stresses that the taking of hostages is a grave breach of international law, particularly Common Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions. In this context, we condemn once again the taking of hostages by Hamas during the 7th October attacks on Israel and emphasize the provisions of Security Council's resolutions 2712, 2720, 2728, and 2735, which call for the release of all hostages. We further stress the imperative of ensuring humanitarian access to these individuals to attend to their medical and other needs. Guyana also emphasizes the obligation of parties to ensure that the remains of anyone who died while being held hostage or detained are handled with dignity and respect. Madam Chair, in the context of the foregoing, allow me to underscore the following 3 points. First, there must be an immediate end to the ongoing hostilities in Gaza to create the conditions for peace, recovery, and for a lasting, just, and comprehensive end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. As Guyana has consistently emphasized, recurring cycles of violence between the two sides only hurt the prospects for a lasting peace and place both Palestinian and Israeli civilians at continued risk of harm, including death. It is therefore important to address the factors driving occurrences, such as those witnessed on 7th October. In this context, Guyana recalls member states' commitment, as elaborated in the UN's Global Counterterrorism Strategy, to, and I quote, address the conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism, including but not limited to prolonged, unresolved conflicts, dehumanization of victims of terrorism in all its forms and manifestations, lack of the rule of law, and violations of human rights, ethnic, national, and religious discrimination, political exclusion, socioeconomic marginalization, and lack of good governance, while recognizing that none of these conditions can excuse or justify acts of terrorism, end of quote. Efforts to combat terrorism must continue to take these important factors into account. Second, the Security Council must be at the forefront of efforts to address breaches of international law, which have implications for the maintenance of international peace and security. Given its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, the Council should be the first to demand accountability for such breaches. It must also be first to institute measures in keeping with the scope provided by the UN Charter to address violations of international law, including in circumstances where those violations feature as the taking of hostages or the administrative detention of innocent civilians. Accountability is an important deterrent. Third and final, the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict calls for principled consistency. By this, I mean that there must be principled and consistent application of international law and principled and consistent responses to wrongdoing. The approach to this conflict should not be determined by convenience based on present circumstances, because this presents the risk of acting from expediency rather than principle. Guyana therefore appeals to this Council and to all Member States to consistently adopt a principled approach to the Palestinian question as we collectively seek to advance a lasting solution. Madam President, allow me to conclude by reiterating the need to bring a definitive end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which keeps manifesting in cycles of violence that produce volumes of hurt to both sides. Let us work to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza, to bring home the remaining men, women, and children, which Hamas took hostage from Israel, and the Palestinians detained in Israeli jails without charge, and to end the aid blockade on Gaza, which is once again stifling Palestinian civilians. Guyana is prepared to do its part to this end in compliance with international law. I thank you.
And I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Denmark. Mr. Sharabi, thank you for your courageous testimony today. Words are not enough to express our condolences for your loss. No one should be forced to endure what you and your loved ones have gone through. I would also like to thank Assistant Secretary General Khiari for your important briefing. Denmark reiterates pose a clear threat, not only to Israel, but into international peace and security. Today, we express our deepest solidarity and grief with all those affected by the hostages taken on October 7th. Our thoughts are with all those that are still held in Gaza, those who came out but are traumatized for life, those who were killed in Hamas captivity, and those whose fate is still uncertain. Amongst those killed is a Danish-Israeli hostage, who we also mourn here today. We reiterate our demand for the immediate, unconditional, safe, and dignified release of the remaining hostages. We also regret that the hostages have not been granted any humanitarian access to address their medical and other humanitarian needs as required under international law, including international humanitarian and human rights law. Colleagues, there's been far too much suffering since October 7th. Suffering of Israelis, in particular those brutally killed or taken hostage, as well as their loved ones. And suffering of civilian Palestinians. More than 50,000 people have lost their lives, most of whom civilians. It is time to break the cycle of violence. We deplore the breakdown of the ceasefire and the subsequent resumption of the Israeli airstrikes and renewed ground operations in Gaza, with further devastation of the civilian population. Over the past few days, there are reports of hundreds of killed. We deeply regret the death of a UNOP staff member and echo the Secretary General's condemnation of all attacks on UN personnel. We call on Israel to live up to its obligations under international law, including the resumption on unimpeded entry of humanitarian aid to Gaza, and ensure that the basic needs of the civilian populations are met. In closing, the suffering we are witnessing on all sides is immense, and the urgency to bring about peace cannot be overstated. Denmark stands firm in our call for the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages and for a permanent ceasefire in Gaza, imperatives that can only be achieved through resumed negotiations. It is our hope that progress on this front will open the pathway towards a two-state solution. For the sake of those who have suffered, both those in Gaza and those such as Mr. Sharabi, and for those future generations of Israelis and Palestinians who deserve to live in peace. I resume my function as President of the Council. The representatives of the United States have asked for the floor to make a further statement.
Thank you, Madam President. I wanted to respond on behalf of the United States, having listened to some of the statements made by others around the Council, on 3 points, if I may. On humanitarian aid, getting into Gaza, I would just reiterate the position that we have articulated, that nobody wants to see Palestinian civilians in Gaza go hungry or thirsty, and that we are working tirelessly to resolve this crisis. With respect to the report issued by the Commission of Inquiry cited by some in the Council today on alleged sexual violence by the IDF, I would point out that this report conflates the acts of a few who will be reprimanded by Israel with the full-fledged sexual violence campaign orchestrated by Hamas on October 7th, and that is disgraceful. With respect to the allegation that Israel is engaging in indiscriminate strikes, the United States would remind Council members that Israel is targeting Hamas leaders and operatives who continue to use civilian infrastructure and hide among the civilian population. And the Council must condemn this practice. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Madam President, allow me at the outset to thank Assistant Secretary General Khalid Khiari for his briefing and to convey through him our condolences and solidarity for the UN staff members killed and injured, some sustaining life-altering injuries and amputation, while they were in UN premises as a result of Israeli bombardment yesterday, and others who were killed recently from UNRWA, as Mr. Lazzarini has informed us. These victims were upholding the UN's most noble mission, trying to save lives. And as all humanitarians, they are having to do so at the peril of their lives. They were upholding the mandate conferred to them by this Council in its Resolution 2720. They are entitled to protection as Palestinian civilians are entitled to protection, and both are being blatantly deprived of it. This demonstrates yet again the indiscriminate nature of Israeli attacks. Allow me also to acknowledge the testimony of Eli Sharabi and present our condolences for his loss. Maybe no one around this table can fully grasp what such a loss means: the killing of loved ones, prolonged captivity, fear and trauma. But Palestinians, us, can. We understand this pain because we live it. They endure it every day. Entire families obliterated in massive and indiscriminate bombardments. Children shot by Israeli snipers in the head and in the chest. Communities uprooted by force. There is not a single Palestinian family that does not have a loved one killed, wounded, detained, or displaced. And they have been enduring these horrors and injustices for decades, even though they reached an unprecedented scale in the last year and a half. When confronted with such loss, either we pursue justice or vengeance. Justice ends suffering. Vengeance perpetuated. Madam President, we will not accept incitement against Palestinian civilians. We will not accept excuses for their killing and maiming and torture. We will not accept justification for collective punishment. We saw Israelis calling for and cheering on genocide. We saw Israelis signing bombs to be dropped on the heads of Palestinian families. We saw Israelis block humanitarian aid to a starving population. We saw Israelis attack innocent Palestinians. but we do not attribute these acts generically to Israeli civilians, nor do we use these actions as justification for indiscriminate killing and maiming and for dehumanizing and punishing millions of people. We have a right to life too, a right to liberty and dignity, a right to live in peace in our ancestral land. Till when will our people have to suffer from the inability to see Palestinians as equals, to acknowledge their suffering and their loss, to remember that around 1 million Palestinians have experienced captivity, that many died while in Israeli jails, killed or left to die? Not a single Palestinian family did not have a Palestinian that visited Israeli jails. Not a single Palestinian family. Israel arrests our children, our doctors, our teachers, our workers, family members, bystanders, parliamentarians, academics, human rights defenders. Israel considers all Palestinians guilty. All Palestinians guilty. Till when will people pretend they do not see the images of Palestinians coming out of Israeli captivity looking like ghosts? Starved and traumatized, beaten and some raped. Till when Israel will pretend it bears no responsibility in the crimes it commits? Till when our humanity and our rights will be denied? We have to note that usually the ones who suffered most on both sides have been among the most passionate advocates for a ceasefire for over a year now. Those who suffer the most, they have solidarity with each other. Their calls should be heeded, as many of you referred to another victim that gave testimony to us, and she asked for the ceasefire to be defended and the 3 stages of the agreement to be implemented. Listen to her. Their calls should be heeded. Their suffering should not be used to inflict more death and devastation or as an excuse for perpetual war, genocide, forced displacement and annexation, dehumanization and hate. The suffering of all civilians must end. All civilians. We have a duty to end the occupation and conflict and to ensure life prevails, to ensure liberty prevails, to ensure shared peace and security prevail, if we truly care about the victims and about our peoples. Madam President, in 42 days, many more hostages were released than in 15 months of indiscriminate bombardments. If Netanyahu truly cared about the hostages, he would not have shattered the ceasefire that was allowing for their release. If anyone needed more evidence that Netanyahu could care less about the fate of the hostages, his decision to resume attacks against Gaza is the ultimate proof. All Israel had to do was move forward in implementing the ceasefire. Everyone knows this truth, starting with the families of the hostages themselves, who are still demonstrating to stop the bloodshed and restore the ceasefire. Killing innocent Palestinian civilians by the hundreds each day, forcibly displacing our population with the clear aim of annexing our land and ending our national identity has nothing to do with hostages or security. It has everything to do with the attempt to destroy the Palestinian people as the means to seize their land. Madam President, the Israeli Minister of War addressed what he called the residents of Gaza, saying, and I quote, "Soon the evacuation of the population from combat zones will resume, and what follows will be far more severe. You will pay the full price, return the hostages and remove Hamas. The alternative is total devastation." End of quotation. After having confessed to weaponizing humanitarian aid, Israel is also confessing to its policy of collective punishment, indiscriminate attacks, and of wanton destruction and devastation. The Israeli government cannot speak of humanity nor denounce barbarism, not when it kills 400 Palestinians in one night, including over 150 children, representing one of the largest single-day child death toll in the last year. Not when it killed 50,000 Palestinians, maimed over 100,000 Palestinians, and destroyed the lives of 2 million people. Not when it is starving our people. Not when it is forcibly displacing them. Not when it is abducting thousands and subjugating them to torture and beating and degrading treatment and sexual violence. Not when it is detaining the corpses of hundreds of Palestinians, denying their families the right to provide their loved ones dignified burial. Israel considered it is barbarism only if it attributes to the act of Hamas, but it is justified if it is committed by Israel. It is barbarism if the act is against an Israeli, and it is legitimate if the act is against a Palestinian. Look at this, despicable, double standard. Israel has a right to kill and maim, to arbitrarily detain and torture, to displace and destroy and devastate, and we have the right to die and disappear. That is not how international law works. There are prohibited actions regardless of the identity of the perpetrators and regardless of the identity of the victims. There are protections afforded to all civilians regardless of the nationality, religion, and race. These prohibitions and protections must be upheld. Madam President, civilians should not be harmed. Civilians should not be harmed. They should not fear being killed in their houses or abducted from their homes. Families should not be torn apart. They should be reunited in life, not in death. Reunited in life, not in death. We have been pushing for a ceasefire that guarantees this aim, while Israel continues advocating for more killing and more destruction. There is no military solution to this conflict. You cannot kill your way to a solution. You cannot negate the millions of Palestinians. We are rooted as olive trees deep in our land. You cannot kill all of us. Again, there is no military solution to this conflict, and you cannot kill your way to a solution. The Israeli government is trying to convince its people that killing, dispossession, and displacing Palestinians is the only way forward, while we have, even in the midst of this genocide, continued to plead for achieving our freedom through peaceful means. Our president from this chamber said, "I am ready to negotiate and to talk peace. And for those who said Ramallah is so close to Jerusalem, he is ready in Jerusalem and in Ramallah and everywhere to talk peace for those who are ready and willing to talk peace. Palestinians is the only way forward, while we have, even in the midst, as I said, of this genocide, continued to plead for achieving our freedom through peaceful means, for respect for international law, for two states living side by side, as many of you state very often, for shared peace and security. It is for every government around the world to choose now the vision they will rally behind and to use all means available to them to see it prevails. Both sidism and balancing acts will not cut it. You have to decide. You cannot play both ways. The fate of millions of people cannot be left to the decisions of this Israeli government that caters far more to the political survival of Netanyahu than the survival of hostages, that wants to get rid of the Palestinian people and steal Palestinian land, that wants to render occupation permanent and peace impossible. The ceasefire is a test. Failing at it means only prolonging the agony and suffering caused by today's horrors, but setting the stage for horrors to come. It is a test we cannot afford to fail. We have to defeat this option. Peace is the only option available to us, to them, and to all of you. Help us to move in the direction of peace and away from the direction of killing and war. And I thank you very much, Madam President.
I thank the Permanent Observer of the Observer State of Palestine for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you to Assistant Secretary General Chiari for your briefing today. I would like to thank the United States, the UK, and France for calling this important session. Before I begin, I want to thank Eli Sharabi for his courage today. Eli, there are no words that can begin to describe the strength it takes to be here after everything you have endured. None of us can truly comprehend the pain, the suffering, the loss you have endured. The torment of 491 days in captivity, the terror of returning to a home that no longer exists, the weight of knowing that your entire world was taken from you. Yet, despite all of this, you sit here today, not for yourself, but for those who remain behind. For over 530 days, 59 innocent men, women, and children have been trapped in Hamas captivity. Many of them are barely holding on to life. Unfortunately, some of them have been murdered, and Hamas has not let the world see a single one of them. These are innocent people being tortured for the crime of being Israelis or being in Israel. They are starving in the dark, alone, afraid, suffering beyond what words can capture. They are denied food, water, and medicine. They are beaten, tortured, and humiliated. They are being held in conditions so inhuman, so depraved, that the hostages who were freed can barely describe what they endured. The cruelty here is not just from Hamas. It is also from the silence of the world. Eli Sharabi testified before you today and laid bare the horrors of his captivity. He described the torment he endured and spoke for the other hostages still in Hamas's hands. Now the question that demands an answer is this: where is the world? Where is your outrage? Where is the international outcry for their release? Where is the demand from every nation to bring them home? Since October 7th, you have passed 77 resolutions in this chamber. There has not been a single resolution condemning Hamas. Meanwhile, there are those in this chamber who refuse to even mention the hostages. Algeria, you have spent months in this room condemning, accusing, and criticizing Israel. But when a human being sits before you today, after enduring the worst of humanity at the hand of those you defend, you could barely acknowledge his presence. You couldn't find the decency to even say his name. That is outrageous. And the world can see it. For 530 days, you have erased the hostages. You have spoken about Gaza without mentioning the crimes of Hamas. You have debated humanitarian assistance without acknowledging the humanitarian crimes Hamas is deliberately inflicting on the hostages. You have had the audacity to talk about a ceasefire without demanding that those held in Hamas's terror tunnels be freed. How can you claim to stand for international law while ignoring the hostages? How can you speak of human rights when you refuse to recognize the most horrific human rights abuse in this war? How can you sit in this chamber, look Eli Sharabi in the eye, and say nothing? The massive amounts of humanitarian aid that Israel has facilitated, coordinated, and allowed into Gaza have reached every segment of the population, except one: the hostages. While Gazan civilians benefit from food, medicine, shelter, and support, these innocent individuals languish in conditions that defy human comprehension. Those hostages have not seen an ounce of that aid. Think how many trucks, how many containers. We listened to you, Eli, that you got a quarter of a pita a day. There are so many on this council, you, who never fail to scream for more aid, more trucks, more shipments, more access, yet you have never once demanded that a single piece of that aid be delivered to our hostages. Not a single word has been spoken. Not a single demand has been made. Not a single resolution has been passed insisting that those in the most desperate need of humanitarian assistance actually receive it. The UN's inaction on the plight of the hostages is a moral collapse of the highest order. To be clear, it's not just this council that has failed. The entire UN system has forsaken its responsibility. So many agencies that claim to be the protectors of humanity have abandoned the hostages entirely. Where was the Security Council? The General Assembly? OCHA? UNICEF? The so-called Human Rights Council? The Red Cross? The Red Cross has not conducted one visit, one inspection. We heard the absurd equation you made about the detainees in Israel. They have 3 meals a day. They have medical treatment. They have visitations of the Red Cross. Before the war, they had visitations of families. How can you compare it? The Red Cross had no one inspection or spent one moment with the hostages in Gaza. And yet, for 530 days, the Red Cross has continued to act according to Hamas's playbook. Colleagues, There is one absolute certainty in this situation. The war will not end until the hostages are freed. Israel did not choose this war. Hamas did. It was Hamas that invaded Israel and Eli's home. It was Hamas that slaughtered our people, and for 3 months it was Hamas who stalled negotiations. Hamas was given the chance to extend the ceasefire. Hamas was given the opportunity to bring relief to the people of Gaza. Hamas was given a choice, and they chose war. Therefore, Israel has resumed its military operations against Hamas with increasing force. The IDF is striking Hamas terror targets throughout the Gaza Strip. Terrorist infrastructure, weapon stockpiles, and command centers are being dismantled. This will continue. This will continue until every last hostage is home. This war does not end with hostages left underground. This war does not end until Hamas is defeated. The choice is simple. If you want a ceasefire, then pressure Hamas to release the hostages immediately. Madam President, Eli Sharabi should not have to be here today. He should have never been taken. He should have never been starved, chained, and brutalized. He should have never lost his wife, his daughters, his brother. And yet, here he is, a survivor of the worst of humanity, asking the world to save those still trapped in that nightmare. I ask you to take a moment and reflect as we speak here today. There are 59 Eli Sharabis underground, desperate for freedom. Imagine their faces. Imagine their screams and their cries. Imagine what they would say to you today. Will you listen or will you look away? Because this moment will not be forgotten. There is no neutrality here. There is no middle ground. There is only right or wrong. We will never stop fighting for the hostages. We will never abandon them. We will never sit idly by as terrorists hold our people as trophies. We will bring them home, all of them. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Israel for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.